On a gray July morning in 1955, the stone walls of Holloway Prison held a silence deeper than most dawns. In that silence, footsteps were heard, echoing against iron and stone, measured and heavy, drawing closer to a chamber where history would close upon a single life. Ruth Ellis, dressed in calm resignation, walked toward the gallows, and with her passed the last woman Britain would ever condemn to such an end. Welcome, dear listener, to this telling of her story. I invite you to share in the comments below the time of day and the place where you find yourself as you join us. In this way, across distance and years, we form a single memory, a quiet remembrance. If you have not yet done so, I ask you gently to subscribe so that this circle of shared remembrance may grow. And now, let us begin. The year was 1955, though in Britain the air still carried traces of the earlier war, as though the great firestorms and the deep shadows of the 40s had left a mist that lingered across a tired land. The city lights were growing brighter, neon signs appeared in Soho, and dance halls throbbed with restless hunger. Yet the law remained severe, the ropes and rituals of capital punishment still binding the lives of those who stepped beyond its boundaries. In that paradox, Ruth Ellis lived her days, a woman drawn to glamour, a mother of fragile circumstance, a lover of dangerous men. And her name would be carved not by her ambitions, but by a single act of violence and its swift retribution. To begin her journey, we must turn back nearly 3 decades to the year of her birth. Ruth Ellis entered the world in 1926 in Rhyl, North Wales, though her earliest steps would not be those of comfort. Her father, Arthur Hornby, had served as a cellist in military bands but was restless, shifting his occupations, his temper known to rise with storms. Her mother, Elisabetta, carried Belgian blood, her accent and bearing setting her apart in a working-class world. The family would move often, their roots unsettled, the children raised with the unease of instability. What does a child learn when home is a place that cannot be trusted to stay still? Perhaps a hunger for belonging, perhaps a determination to shape one's own face before the mirror, to choose who one will appear to be. Her youth unfolded as Britain braced for conflict, for whispers of war traveled through newspapers and radio broadcasts, and by her teenage years the air raid sirens had become part of her daily soundscape. London, to which the family moved, was not the London of prosperity, but the London of ration books, of bomb craters, of long nights broken by searchlights in the sky. In such a city, young Ruth grew into her beauty. She was slender, with fair hair, a gaze at once soft and sharp. Men noticed her. She noticed, too, how her looks could draw attention, how it opened small doors of opportunity in a world where money and security were scarce. She began to model, to step into photographs, into contests of beauty, her image shaped by fashion photographers who saw in her a spark of glamour. Yet beneath this shaping lay a girl raised in hardship, whose laughter was often louder than her inner calm. And so we return to the July morning with which we began, for the woman walking to the gallows was also the girl of bombed-out streets, of restless dreams, of ambition too vast for the cage of her birth. One cannot draw a line from cradle to execution chamber without passing through many shadows. And it is in those shadows that her story lies. Let us then dwell for a while with the young Ruth, not yet a hostess of London's nightlife, not yet a mother, nor a lover betrayed, but simply a daughter of a fractured household. Imagine the small kitchen of her family's home, where the air smelled of damp coal, where her mother's voice carried a trace of faraway lands, and where arguments could rise as suddenly as storms. Imagine Ruth herself, sitting at the table, tracing patterns on its worn surface, hearing the footsteps of her father pacing with unsettled temper. This was not the soil of comfort, but of endurance. Endurance, however, often blossoms into rebellion, and so it would with her. The sound of a heavy key turning in a lock is where we paused at the opening, and it is there we linger now. For that sound, echoing in Holloway Prison on the morning of her execution, was not so different from the many sounds that marked her life. Doors closing behind her, choices narrowing, rooms in which she found herself confined, whether by circumstance or by her own actions. Each key turned seemed to bind her more tightly to the fate that would unfold. And yet, can we ever say that fate is certain? Was Ruth Ellis born to walk those final steps, or was she simply carried along by tides too strong for her to resist? The answer lies not in certainty, but in the images that remain, the dim lamplight of post-war streets, the glimmer of sequined dresses in smoke-filled clubs, the glances exchanged across tables heavy with champagne, and the silent rooms of prison where footsteps grew louder with each passing dawn. The key turns, the lock clicks, and we find ourselves waiting in the stillness of that sound, wondering what waits on the other side. The lock turns, the sound lingers, and from that echo we are carried backward to a different door, one not of prison stone, but of an old house in the years before the war. The wood is weathered, the hinges creak, and beyond it lies a family gathered in the small rooms where Ruth Ellis first learned the measure of belonging. Born in 1926 in the seaside town of Rill, Ruth would not remain long in that place, for her father's restless hand guided the family from one dwelling to another, never rooted, never certain. He was a man of music once, a cellist in a military band, yet he carried tempests within him, moods that shifted like winds at sea. Her mother, of Belgian descent, spoke with an accent that marked her as foreign, and in the working-class neighborhoods of England such difference was rarely welcomed. Their home was not one of harmony, but of struggle, where each day's stability was fragile, where children learned early the art of silence in moments of anger. Ruth was the fifth of 6 children, her life framed by brothers and sisters whose own paths bent under the weight of hardship. Poverty was no stranger in their household. Meals were simple, possessions sparse, and the horizon of possibility seemed narrow. Yet within Ruth there stirred a sense of self that reached beyond those confines. Perhaps it was her mother's stories of another land, her soft accent hinting at a world more refined than their crowded rooms. Perhaps it was the mirror, which reflected to Ruth a face of striking beauty, a face that others seemed to notice even when she was still a girl. And beauty, in a world where money and status were scarce, could become its own form of currency, its own means of escape. The years of her childhood soon merged with the gathering clouds of war. In the late 1930s, as Ruth grew from child into young woman, Britain prepared for conflict, and by her teenage years the bombs were falling upon London. The family had by then moved south, drawn by the search for work and chance. London was a city of blackouts, of sirens piercing the night, of children huddled in shelters while the ground trembled above. For Ruth, these were formative sounds. The war etched into her memory, not through headlines, but through the very air she breathed. She would later recall the long hours in shelters, the damp smell of earth, the flickering lamps that cast shadows on faces waiting for the all-clear. Such experiences do not vanish when the bombs cease. They live on as a hunger for brightness, for music and light and motion, all that was denied in those years of waiting. Amid the rubble and rationing, Ruth's beauty began to draw attention. She was slim, her features delicate yet lively, her gaze carrying a spark that seemed to suggest both defiance and invitation. She found work as a waitress, as a factory girl, as so many did. Yet what set her apart was the way heads turned when she entered a room. Some said she carried herself like a starlet even before she had any stage. And so she drifted toward modeling, toward beauty contests, toward any opportunity that allowed her to stand beneath the light, to be seen not as another working-class girl, but as someone touched by glamour. In the world of post-war austerity, where women still queued for rationed butter and children played in bomb sites, the image of beauty carried a power beyond its surface. It promised escape. It hinted at luxury. It suggested a door leading away from the gray streets into a realm of possibility. Yet behind that promise lay questions. What does beauty cost when it becomes the foundation of survival? Does it empower, or does it entrap? Ruth herself could not have answered with certainty, for she was still so young, still shaping herself, still deciding whether her smile was a mask or a key. And in that uncertainty lay the seeds of her future, a future that would lead her into rooms where champagne glasses sparkled, where men whispered promises, and where betrayal and violence lay hidden beneath charm. As she grew, Ruth began to test the strength of her independence. She left school early, took small jobs, moved through the restless streets with a confidence that belied her fragile circumstances. She discovered the dance halls, the clubs where music played loud enough to drown the echoes of war, where men in sharp suits and women in bright dresses sought distraction. There, Ruth learned how to carry herself, how to attract, how to smile in ways that conceal doubt. She began to see the outlines of the world she wanted, not the world of her father's temper and her mother's quiet endurance, but a world of glamour, of light, of men with cars and money and promises of protection. Still, the shadows of childhood clung to her. Those who knew her in youth spoke later of her quick temper, her intensity, her need for love that was often greater than the love she received. In her household, she had not known steady affection. Now, as a young woman, she sought it with fierce hunger. This hunger would one day draw her into the arms of men who could not offer her what she needed, men whose charm masked cruelty, men who would leave her more wounded than she had begun. But that is to come. For now, in these early years, she is simply Ruth, restless, radiant, and unanchored. The faint smell of cigarette smoke lingers in the back rooms of these clubs, mingling with the scent of perfume and the sweetness of spilled drink. It clings to her clothes as she returns home late, her shoes clicking on the damp pavement, the city still restless though the war has ended. This smoke, curling in the dim light, becomes a kind of veil, a symbol of the life she is stepping into, a life where appearances conceal truths, where glamour covers bruises, where a smile can hide despair. And so we leave her here, in the glow of neon signs and the haze of smoke, a young woman stepping into a world she half understands. The war is over, the city is alive with music, and Ruth Ellis is only beginning to shape the mask she will wear before the world. The smoke lingers, heavy, unresolved, as if the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for what comes next. The cigarette smoke curls upward, its thin threads blurring into the dim light of the club, and as it drifts, it becomes the air of London itself in those restless years after the war, heavy, unsettled, yet alive with promise. Ruth Ellis breathed in that air as she walked the streets in her heels, the sharp rhythm of leather striking damp pavement, announcing her presence even before her figure appeared. London was a city both wounded and awakening, its scars of bomb sites visible beside the neon signs that now glowed in Soho and Camden, its ration book still weighing on pockets, while dance halls filled with music and laughter. For a young woman of ambition and beauty, it was a place of contradiction. Opportunity shimmered, but so too did danger, hidden in every shadow where desire and money crossed paths. Ruth was no longer the uncertain girl of her family's cramped home. She was carving herself anew in the bright mirrors of the city. She took work wherever she could, waitress, cinema usherette, small modeling jobs, yet her gaze was always drawn to the places where glamour seemed most attainable. The dance halls offered her more than music, they offered her attention. She would enter, hair set and lips painted, and feel eyes turn. In those glances she sensed a form of power, however fleeting. Perhaps, she thought, this was the path out of the narrow life she had known. Yet in every glance also lay a bargain. for beauty was not admired without cost, and Ruth would learn that what seemed like power could become a snare. She met men who promised her much, men who wore fine suits and spoke of money, of cars, of escape from the ration lines. Some were kind for an evening, others cruel by dawn. Ruth learned quickly that the city's brightness was laced with shadows, that behind laughter at tables lined with glasses, there could lie anger, jealousy, and violence. But she also discovered in herself a hunger, not merely for wealth or for attention, but for belonging, for love that would anchor her in a world where she still felt unsteady. That hunger grew fierce, and with it grew her willingness to endure what another might have fled from. Her modeling continued in small bursts. Photographers noted her photogenic face, her striking hair, her ability to pose with natural poise. She entered beauty contests, won some, lost others, and in each victory she felt a confirmation that she could rise beyond the limits of her childhood. Newspapers occasionally printed her image, a fleeting glimpse of glamour in a city still grayer than it wished to be. To strangers she might have seemed charmed, yet behind those images Ruth's private life was more fragile. Work was never steady, money was never enough. The family she had grown up with offered little comfort, and her attempts to shape herself into something more often left her exhausted. Still, she pressed forward, for to stop would be to sink back into the shadows she feared most. It was in this world of smoky clubs and flashing cameras that Ruth began her first serious romances, each carrying the mark of intensity, each revealing the sharp edge of her desire for passion and her vulnerability to harm. She did not seek mild affection, she sought fire, and in that seeking she often burned her own hands. Men were drawn to her beauty, but they were not always gentle. Some saw her as a prize, others as a toy, and in her longing for love she sometimes allowed herself to be treated as less than she deserved. Friends who knew her in these years would later recall her quick temper, her tears, her bursts of laughter that could change in an instant to silence. She was a woman of contrasts, radiant yet restless, bold yet uncertain, her emotions never far from the surface. At night, when the clubs closed and the music ceased, Ruth would walk home through streets where the rain slicked the cobblestones, the neon signs reflected in broken puddles. The sound of her heels striking the ground carried in the quiet, echoing in ways she perhaps did not notice. To onlookers she seemed confident, almost untouchable, yet within her the questions grew. Was she shaping her life, or was her life shaping her, drawing her into patterns she could not escape? The rhythm of her footsteps was steady, but did it lead toward light or toward shadow? She entered a circle of women like herself, hostesses and dancers who worked in nightclubs, who earned their money by charm and by the careful balance of allure and restraint. They taught her how to pour drinks with a smile, how to laugh at a man's joke even when it wearied her, how to walk the fine line between invitation and refusal. Ruth proved a quick learner. She could be warm, she could be sharp, and she could hold the attention of a room. In those years, she was remaking herself into a figure of the nightlife, a woman who appeared glamorous to others, though she herself still went home to modest rooms and the worries of bills unpaid. The city hummed around her, the rumble of buses, the chatter of voices spilling out of pubs, the rustle of newspapers telling of politics and scandals, the low drone of jazz bands that played until dawn. All of it formed the background music to Ruth's youth, a symphony of chance and change. She walked through it as one might walk through smoke, never seeing the edges clearly, only knowing that she must keep moving forward. And so the cigarette smoke with which we began does not vanish. It remains in the air, clinging to her clothes, curling in her hair, following her as she steps through the doors of one club after another. It is the mark of the life she has chosen, or perhaps the life that has chosen her. That smoke veils her laughter, hides her sorrow, and becomes the very breath of her nights. Yet beneath it, her heart beats with a yearning that no drink, no photograph, No glance from a stranger can truly satisfy. The sound of her heels striking the pavement grows louder, echoing in the quiet of the night, until it fades again into the distance, unresolved, leaving us to wonder where those footsteps will carry her next. The sound of heels striking damp pavement fades into the dim glow of street lamps, and from that sound, we pass through the doors of a nightclub where Ruth Ellis would soon take her place among the hostesses who gave shape to London's restless nights. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, laughter, and the clink of glasses. Music drifted from the stage, sometimes a jazz number played on a worn piano, sometimes a dance tune carried by a small band that did not quite drown out the hum of conversation. Men leaned at the bar, their voices loud, their wallets ready. Women in sequined dresses and bright lipstick moved with practiced ease, smiling, listening, pouring drinks. And in those gestures, a small economy of glamour was sustained. Ruth stepped into this world with both curiosity and caution. She had already tasted the attention of men in dance halls, the allure of modeling contests, the brief brightness of cameras, but hostessing was something more deliberate. Here she was expected to perform charm, to wrap herself in allure as though it were a gown. She quickly discovered that her beauty was an advantage. Men noticed her, sought her company, paid for her time. Yet she also learned how thin that advantage could be, how easily admiration could become expectation, how quickly a smile could be mistaken for surrender. Still, she carried herself with poise, her hair shining under the low lights, her laughter carrying across the tables. To those who watched her, she seemed radiant, a woman in control. To Ruth herself, each night was a mixture of triumph and weariness, for the attention she received never filled the hollow places within. The clubs of post-war London were places of contradiction. On one hand, they offered escape from the ration books, from the rubble still scattered across the city, from the ordinary struggles of daily life. Men with money, sometimes businessmen, sometimes men only pretending at wealth, sought out the illusion of glamour. Women like Ruth provided it, if only for a night, creating an atmosphere of light in a world still carrying shadows. On the other hand, these clubs were also places of danger, where drink flowed too freely, where tempers rose quickly, where women walked a thin line between independence and exploitation. Ruth soon understood both sides, and she adapted as best she could, cultivating an image that would draw attention without surrendering too much of herself. Behind the glamour, however, her life was never far from hardship. She still lived modestly, still struggled with bills, still sought a security that seemed always just out of reach. Some men who courted her offered promises, but few fulfilled them. Some offered protection, but their protection often came with bruises. Ruth accepted these contradictions, perhaps believing that in time she might find one man whose devotion was true, whose wealth or status would provide her with the life she longed for. In the meantime, she worked, night after night, smiling through exhaustion, laughing through disappointment. It was during these years that Ruth began to shape herself more deliberately into an image of glamour. She bleached her hair to a bright, striking blonde, a shade that drew eyes as surely as a flame draws moths. She dressed carefully, her style echoing the movie stars whose pictures filled cinema posters. She carried herself with confidence, though her confidence was as much performance as truth. She had learned that appearance could be armor, that beauty could shield her from at least some of the harshness of the world. Yet like all armor, it was heavy, and beneath it, she remained vulnerable. The clink of glasses echoed through those clubs, each sound a marker of an evening's progress. To one man, Ruth was a companion for an hour. To another, she was a confidant, a distraction from loneliness. To herself, she was both actress and survivor, moving through each night with a mixture of grace and weariness. And in that role, she discovered a new kind of power, the ability to draw attention, to command a room, even if the price was exhaustion and the risk of violence. At times, when the music slowed and the laughter dimmed, Ruth would allow herself to wonder whether this path was leading her anywhere at all. Was she climbing upward toward the life she dreamed of? Or was she simply circling the same rooms night after night, breathing the same smoke, hearing the same promises? The answer was never clear, and perhaps it was that uncertainty that drove her forward, hoping each new encounter might finally open the door she longed to find. It was in these very clubs that Ruth would encounter men who would change her life, men of wealth, men of charm, men of danger. But for now, in these early hostessing years, she was still learning the roles, still weaving herself into the fabric of London's nightlife. She was both admired and used, both celebrated and forgotten, and in that contradiction lay the essence of her life to come. Outside, the city pulsed with its own rhythm, the roar of buses, the chatter of late-night crowds, the muffled footsteps of couples leaving hand in hand, all blended into the background of Ruth's nights. Inside, the air grew heavy with smoke, the glasses clinked, the laughter rose again. Ruth moved among it all, smiling, listening, her heels clicking across the floor as though marking time itself. Each evening ended as it began, with smoke in the air and the faint scent of perfume and spilled drink clinging to her clothes. The laughter around her often rang false, bright on the surface but hollow within. Perhaps Ruth sensed that hollowness, perhaps she ignored it, perhaps she embraced it, for it mirrored something within herself. The glamour of the clubs was real in its moment, but fleeting, dissolving as the dawn light crept in. Ruth knew this, and yet she continued, night after night, as though searching for something just beyond her reach. And so we end here with the sound of laughter, not joyous but fragile, rising above the clink of glasses before dissolving into the haze of smoke. It lingers, unresolved, leaving us to wonder what truths lie behind that laughter and what it concealed in Ruth Ellis's restless heart. The laughter fades, fragile as smoke, rising above the clink of glasses before dissolving into silence. And from that silence comes another sound, softer yet more intimate, the cry of a newborn child carried through the thin walls of a modest flat. Before that cry, however, there was love, or what Ruth Ellis believed to be love, a promise spoken in hurried words, a vow made between two restless hearts. In 1950, she married George Ellis, a man whose presence seemed at first to offer her the stability she longed for. He was a divorced dentist, older than Ruth, with the appearance of success and the confidence of one who knew how to impress. To Ruth, still seeking an anchor, he seemed the answer. She saw in him not only a partner, but the possibility of protection, a father for her child, a man who might finally give her the security that all her nights in clubs and all her laughter among strangers had failed to provide. But promises are not always kept, and affection can sour quickly. George was charismatic, yes, but his charm carried shadows. He drank heavily, and drink sharpened his temper. The marriage, brief though it was, soon revealed itself as a cycle of passion and pain. There were quarrels, sharp words, and darker moments of violence. Ruth, who had hoped to find stability, found herself instead in the same turmoil she had known since childhood, only now the storms came from the man she called husband. Yet she remained for a time, clinging to the hope that love could conquer cruelty, that beneath his anger there was tenderness she could draw out. When she gave birth to her son, Andy, the fragile bond between them seemed to strengthen. Ruth loved her child fiercely, with a devotion that became the truest anchor of her life. She held him close, listened to his cries in the night, and for a while believed that motherhood might redeem the chaos of her marriage. But George's violence and infidelity continued, and the marriage dissolved in bitterness. Ruth, now a single mother, returned to the world of hostessing and modeling, her child left in the care of relatives or friends when her nights demanded her presence elsewhere. The cry of her baby remained in her memory. However, a sound that haunted her when the clubs grew too loud, a reminder of the part of herself that sought not glamour, but gentleness. Motherhood changed Ruth in ways she did not always show. She became more determined, more protective, her love for her son fierce enough to endure the hardships of single parenthood. Yet it also made her more vulnerable, for she knew that every choice she made affected not only herself, but the boy who bore her name. She longed to give him more than she had been given, to shield him from the storms she herself had endured. But the path she chose, the clubs, the men, the nightlife, was not a path of safety. It was a path of survival, and survival often demands compromise. Ruth's days were divided between the tender duties of motherhood and the harsh performances of the night. By day, she was mother, cradling her son, feeding him, watching him grow. By night, she was hostess, laughing at jokes, pouring drinks, standing beneath lights that concealed her fatigue. These two selves coexisted uneasily, and Ruth carried both with her wherever she went. Friends who knew her at the time spoke of her devotion to Andy, of the way she spoke of him with pride and protectiveness. They also spoke of her exhaustion, of the way her work consumed her, of the strain that showed beneath the mask of glamour. Photographs from this period show Ruth in carefully posed images, her hair styled, her gaze confident, her smile radiant. Yet in the shadows of those images, one can imagine the other Ruth, the young mother alone at night, listening for the cry of her child, wondering how she might build a better life for him. Beauty contests and magazine appearances brought her fleeting recognition, but they did not bring lasting security. The world applauded her image but did not ease her struggles. The contrast between Ruth's public and private life deepened during these years. In public, she was dazzling, admired, desired. In private, she was weary, anxious, uncertain of the future. Her relationships with men reflected this contrast. Some were drawn to her beauty, some to her vulnerability, but few offered the stability she longed for. The pattern of charm followed by betrayal repeated itself, leaving Ruth bruised not only in body but in spirit. She seemed unable to escape the cycle, perhaps because her hunger for love was greater than her fear of pain. She wanted so desperately to be loved that she accepted what others might have refused. Still, there were moments of joy. Ruth adored dressing elegantly, going out, being admired. She enjoyed the attention her beauty brought, the small triumphs of winning contests or seeing her photograph in print. She delighted in her son's smile, in the small milestones of his childhood. These moments did not erase her hardships, but they gave her reason to continue. She lived in contradictions, mother and hostess, admired and mistreated, strong and fragile. The sound of a baby's quiet cry remains in the air, unresolved, lingering in the silence between laughter and tears. It is the sound of innocence in a world too harsh, the sound of love in a life too restless. Ruth Ellis carried that sound with her always, even as she walked into the glittering, dangerous world that awaited her next. The quiet cry of the child lingers in the stillness, and from that fragile sound we follow Ruth Ellis into the years when motherhood became both her deepest devotion and her heaviest burden. The boy she called Andy was her anchor, the one presence that reminded her of tenderness when the nights of smoke and laughter left her hollow. Yet being a mother in Ruth's world was no simple matter. She lived between two existences, each demanding, each incomplete. By day, she was mother, holding her son close, watching him with an intensity that revealed both her love and her fear. By night, she was hostess, her face painted, her smile practiced, her steps quick as she moved through rooms of strangers. The two lives rarely met, yet each shaped the other, and Ruth walked the line between them with both pride and exhaustion. Andy was a child born into uncertainty. His father, George Ellis, had vanished into the fog of drink and bitterness, leaving Ruth to shoulder alone the responsibility of care. She relied often on family and friends to help, for her nights in the clubs kept her away from the quiet rhythms of motherhood. Yet no matter how much she struggled, Ruth returned to him always with affection, her devotion to her son perhaps the purest love she ever knew. Those who later spoke of her remembered how fiercely protective she was, how she spoke of Andy with pride, how she sought always to provide him with something better than what she herself had known. Still, love could not erase hardship. Money was scarce, work was unstable, and the clubs that offered her wages also demanded her spirit. She longed for a partner who might help carry the burden, who might love both her and her child, who might bring to their lives the security she had been denied since her own childhood. This longing grew into a restless search, a cycle of relationships that promised much and delivered little. Each disappointment deepened her hunger, and each betrayal left her more fragile. Yet her devotion to Andy never wavered. He was her reason for continuing, her hope embodied, the one presence that gave meaning to her struggles. There were nights when Ruth would return home from hostessing, weary and smelling of smoke, only to find her son asleep in another's care. She would watch him in the dim light, his small chest rising and falling, his innocence untouched by the chaos of her world. In those moments she felt both joy and sorrow, joy that he was hers, sorrow that she could not give him more. She would lean close, perhaps whisper to him, though he did not stir. The sound of his breathing became her lullaby, the rhythm that quieted her own restless thoughts. At times, her motherhood brought her into conflict with those around her. Men who courted her did not always welcome the presence of a child, and some pressed her to choose between her role as mother and her role as lover. Ruth, unwilling to relinquish either, tried to balance both, though the effort often left her torn. She wanted love, she wanted security, she wanted glamour, but she also wanted her son safe and cherished. The world, however, rarely allowed her such completeness. She found herself sacrificing rest, comfort, and even dignity to hold on to both dreams at once. Photographs from these years capture her as a figure of elegance, her hair bleached bright, her smile confident, her dresses chosen to enhance her allure. Yet behind those images stood the mother who ironed small clothes, who worried about rent, who counted coins carefully before the week was through. Few who saw her in the clubs would have imagined the tenderness with which she bent over her child, or the weight she carried in trying to be both glamorous and maternal. This duality defined her life, a constant balancing act between two worlds that seldom understood each other. Motherhood also sharpened Ruth's sense of longing for stability. She wanted a home where Andy might grow in safety, where she might play the part of mother without disguise. This longing often influenced her choices in men, for she sought not only affection but provision, not only passion but protection. Yet the men she chose, perhaps because of her own intensity, perhaps because of the circles in which she moved, were rarely gentle. Many were drawn to her beauty but repelled by her responsibilities, or else they embraced her for a time only to abandon her when their desire waned. Each loss weighed heavily, but Ruth returned always to her son, as though he were the only true constant in a world of shifting promises. There's something haunting in imagining Ruth walking home from a night of work, her heels clicking on wet pavement, her body weary, her face painted with fading makeup, carrying in her heart both the echoes of laughter from the club and the hope of hearing her son's quiet breathing as she entered the small flat. That sound, the soft breath of a sleeping child, became her refuge, her reminder that even amid hardship, there was innocence worth protecting. Yet even this refuge was fragile, for her circumstances left her no space to rest, no time to recover. She lived in constant motion, pulled between her devotion to Andy and her need to survive in the world of nightclubs and men. Some might ask whether motherhood softened Ruth, whether it calmed her quick temper, whether it drew her closer to gentleness. Perhaps in some ways it did, for she loved deeply. But it also heightened her vulnerability, for every betrayal, every disappointment, every moment of despair weighed heavier, when she considered its impact on her child. She bore her own pain, but she feared above all that he might suffer because of her choices. This fear would remain with her always, even as her life grew more entangled in the passions and violence that would lead to her downfall. The image of a photograph pressed flat beneath glass lingers here, a picture of Ruth with her son, both smiling, both appearing content. Yet behind the image lies the truth, a life divided, a love fierce but fragile, a woman struggling to give her child a better world even as she stumbled through her own. The photograph endures, still, silent and unresolved, a reminder of what she longed for, but could never fully secure. The photograph pressed beneath glass lies still, a frozen smile that conceals the turbulence beneath, and from its silent image we drift into another flash of light, the sharp burst of a photographer's bulb, whitening the room for a moment before fading again to shadow. It was in such flashes that Ruth Ellis sought to reinvent herself, stepping from the weary struggles of motherhood into the glittering, if fleeting, world of modeling and beauty contests. She had learned early that her appearance was not merely a feature of her being, but a doorway, a means of opening paths otherwise closed to a woman of her background. The camera, unfeeling and exact, captured what others admired in her. The pale hair, bleached to brightness as though it held its own light, the slender figure, the eyes that could appear both soft and steely depending on the angle of gaze. In those years after the war, London hungered for symbols of glamour. Newspapers and magazines, still modest in their reach, sought faces that could distract a weary public from rationing and rebuilding. Beauty contests, held in town halls and small theaters, offered women a stage on which to display not only physical charm, but a kind of confidence that seemed to belong to another world. Ruth entered these contests with determination. Sometimes she won, sometimes she merely placed, but always she drew attention. The applause she received, the photographs printed in papers, the admiring glances, these became validations that she was something more than the girl from a poor and fractured family. Modeling assignments, too, gave her moments of escape. Photographers posed her in carefully arranged settings, dressed her in clothes she could not otherwise afford, and instructed her to look serene, alluring, or playful according to their vision. For a brief while, she became part of a world she longed to inhabit, a world of elegance and luxury. Yet these moments were as fragile as the paper on which her images were printed. The pay was small, the opportunities irregular, and the work itself exhausting in its demands. The glamour others saw was not the daily reality of Ruth's life. Behind the bright images stood a woman still worrying over rent, still caring for her son, still enduring relationships that bruised more than they comforted. And yet these images mattered. They gave Ruth a sense of self that was otherwise denied her. Each time a photograph captured her with poise, she could see herself as more than a struggling hostess or a weary mother. She could imagine herself as the woman she longed to be, admired, independent, secure. It was a mask, perhaps, but also a hope. And masks, once worn long enough, begin to shape the face beneath. Those who knew her then spoke of her as a woman who lived between extremes. At times she was radiant, full of laughter, delighting in her role as a model or contest winner. At other times she was withdrawn, her temper quick, her tears near the surface. The mask of glamour was not always strong enough to conceal the turmoil within. But Ruth pressed on, believing that each new photograph, each new contest, each new admirer might finally lead to the life she sought. There is a poignancy in imagining her in a studio, standing beneath the glare of lights, holding a pose as the photographer adjusted his lens. Outside the room, London continued in its gray ordinariness. Buses rattling by, children playing in bomb-damaged streets, women queuing for provisions. Inside, for a moment, Ruth was transformed, part of a world of beauty and desire. When the flash came, it seared her image into film, an image that might appear in print a week later, admired by strangers who would never know the woman behind the smile. The flash faded, the lights dimmed, and she stepped once more into her ordinary struggles. The glamour concealed the bruises that life left upon her. Ruth had learned to endure violence from men who professed to care for her. She had learned to smile even when weary. She had learned to hide the lines of worry behind powder and rouge. The photographs captured her appearance, but they did not capture the deeper truths of her life. Perhaps that was part of their allure, to present a surface that denied the reality beneath. Still, Ruth clung to this world of images. Each photograph was a fragment of the woman she wished to be, and though the fragments never formed a complete picture, they sustained her through the harshness of daily life. She could point to them, could show others, could remind herself that she was more than her circumstances. In this way, the camera became both her ally and her deceiver. It gave her the illusion of progress, even as her struggles remained unchanged. As the years passed, her reputation as a beauty grew in small circles. She became known in certain clubs, recognized in certain contests, spoken of as a woman of allure. Yet this recognition did not free her. It bound her more tightly to the role of glamour. She was expected always to appear radiant, always to maintain the image. To falter was to risk losing the only currency she possessed. And so she pressed on, smiling through weariness, posing through sorrow, allowing the flash to erase her truth. The image of a flash lingers here, blinding for a moment before fading into darkness. It is an image unresolved, a reminder that what we see is not always what is. Behind the brightness lay shadows that the camera never captured, and within those shadows Ruth Ellis continued her restless search for love, for belonging, for a life that would not vanish when the lights went out. The bright flash fades, leaving the eyes momentarily blind, and from that brightness another light emerges, harsher and louder. The twin beams of car headlights cutting across a damp London road, followed by the growl of an engine rising into the night. In the years after her forays into modeling and contests, Ruth Ellis drifted towards circles where wealth and speed were displayed not in photographs, but in polished machines. Men leaning against their cars with cigarettes in hand, the scent of oil and petrol mixing with perfume and champagne. It was here, among the world of racing enthusiasts, that she would meet the man who would define and ultimately destroy the final chapter of her life. David Blakeley was a young racing driver, his manner careless, his charm undeniable to those who admired him. He was tall, well-dressed, with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world belonged to him. To Ruth, already accustomed to men of glamour and promise, he appeared as the embodiment of excitement. He moved with the same intensity as the cars he drove, engines roaring, tires screeching, the thrill of speed always in his blood. His presence was magnetic, and Ruth, weary of disappointment yet still hungry for passion, was drawn to him with the inevitability of a moth to flame. Their meeting was like so many others in her life, a chance introduction in the circles of London nightlife, words exchanged, glances that lingered, the spark of attraction burning quickly. Ruth admired his daring, his recklessness, his ability to command a room without effort. He admired her beauty, her glamour, her vulnerability disguised as confidence. Together they formed a pair that others noticed, the blonde hostess and the racing driver, both radiant in their own ways, both restless, both flawed. Yet from the beginning their bond carried shadows. David was engaged to another woman, a wealthy young lady from a background far more secure than Ruth's. He belonged to a world of privilege, of money and country estates, a world that had no place for the working-class hostess with a child at home. Ruth knew this, yet she could not resist him. She wanted not only his love, but also the world he represented, a world that seemed to promise escape from the hardships that had defined her life. For his part, David was captivated by her allure, Yet he was careless, his affections divided, his temper quick to rise. Their affair unfolded with the intensity of fire, bright, consuming, and dangerous. At first there were moments of joy, nights of laughter, drives in his car, the thrill of being with someone so admired. Ruth would stand beside him, her blonde hair catching the light, her presence adding to his aura of success. They were seen together in clubs, their names whispered, their passion evident. Yet beneath the surface, cracks appeared. David drank heavily, and drink sharpened his cruelty. He could be dismissive, even violent. He would disappear for days, return with excuses, sometimes with bruises left upon Ruth. Still, she clung to him. For Ruth, love was never mild. It was fierce, consuming, an anchor in a storm all at once. She had endured violence before, had been disappointed before, yet she always returned, hoping this time would be different, hoping that her devotion would soften the cruelty, that her love would make him stay. With David, her hunger for belonging became desperate. She wanted him not only for himself, but as a promise of stability, a promise that she and her son might one day be part of the world he represented. Friends who watched the affair unfold saw the danger. They warned her, they counseled caution, but Ruth's heart was not swayed by reason. She was addicted to the intensity, to the passion, to the feeling of being alive in his presence. Even the pain seemed part of the bargain, part of the fire she could not resist. Love for her was never safe. It was always a gamble, always a risk, and with David the stakes were higher than ever. There were nights when the roar of his car echoed down her street, the headlights flashing as he arrived, and she would run to meet him with both joy and fear. There were nights when he did not come at all, leaving her waiting, pacing, her heart aching with suspicion and despair. The rhythm of their affair was as unstable as the racing circuits he drove, filled with sharp turns, sudden stops, crashes barely avoided. Ruth lived in that rhythm, unable to step away, unwilling to surrender. As the months passed, the affair grew darker. David's neglect deepened. His violence became more pronounced, his indifference more cruel. Ruth, in turn, became more desperate, more possessive, more consumed by the need to hold him. The glamour that had once surrounded them began to fade, replaced by whispers of scandal, by scenes of public quarrels, by the visible toll it took upon her. Her body bore the marks of his anger, her spirit bore the weight of his betrayal. Yet still she stayed, still she returned, still she believed that love, if held tightly enough, might finally deliver what it promised. The roar of an engine fades into the night, leaving behind the smell of petrol and the echo of tires on wet roads. It is an unresolved sound, lingering in the air, carrying with it the tension of a passion too fierce to last, a bond too fragile to endure. And in that fading roar lies the question that shadows Ruth's life. Why do we return to the fire even when it burns us? The roar of the engine fades into the night, and what remains is a quieter sound, more insistent and more human, the throb of a heartbeat, steady at first, then quickening, echoing in the hollow of the chest. It is in this rhythm that Ruth Ellis lived during the height of her affair with David Blakeley, her pulse rising and falling with his presence, her breath catching in anticipation or despair, depending on whether he came to her door or stayed away. Their relationship was no gentle drift, but a violent storm, a cycle of passion and betrayal that carried Ruth deeper into turmoil with each passing month. In the beginning, there were moments when her heart raced with delight. She would see him across a crowded room, his eyes catching hers, his smile drawing her close. She would feel the warmth of his arm around her, the thrill of speeding beside him in his car, the laughter that rose in them when the night seemed endless. In those moments, her heartbeat was fast with joy, the world seeming to open, the pain of her past forgotten. Yet such moments never lasted long. Just as quickly came the crashes, the quarrels, the absences that left her waiting alone. The same heart that had pounded with joy now beat heavy with sorrow, with anger, with fear. David was careless with her devotion. He belonged to another world, one of wealthy friends and country weekends, and he never fully invited Ruth into it. He came and went as he pleased, often with little explanation, often leaving her to wonder where he was and with whom. When he returned, sometimes drunk, sometimes angry, the tenderness of their passion turned to violence. He struck her, belittled her, left her bruised both in body and in spirit. Yet Ruth, bound by her hunger for love, returned to him again and again. She believed, or wanted to believe, that her devotion could change him, that her willingness to endure might earn her the love she longed for. Friends saw her suffering. They urged her to leave him, to protect herself, to think of her child, but Ruth could not. She was caught in a cycle she could neither break nor resist. The very intensity of their affair seemed to bind her more tightly, as though the pain itself confirmed the depth of her passion. She would say later, in moments of weary honesty, that she could not stop herself, that she loved him beyond reason. Love, for Ruth, was not a choice, but a compulsion, a need that burned within her even when it destroyed her. There were nights when their quarrels spilled into public view, when voices were raised in clubs, when glasses were shattered in anger, when bystanders turned to watch the drama unfold. Ruth's temper was quick, her jealousy fierce, and David's arrogance only fueled the fire. They accused, they shouted, they reconciled with kisses, only to fall again into the same cycle. Theirs was a love that consumed rather than sustained, a fire that devoured rather than warmed. And yet, even knowing this, Ruth clung to it, for without it she felt herself adrift, unmoored, her heart empty. The toll of this passion was not only emotional but physical. Ruth endured repeated abortions during the course of their relationship, procedures that left her weakened, her body scarred, her spirit more fragile. Each time she hoped for something lasting, each time it ended in loss. The grief of these experiences was seldom spoken aloud, yet it weighed upon her, deepening her desperation, binding her more tightly to the man who had caused the pain. She wanted from David not only love but recognition, the acknowledgement that their bond was real, that it was worth the sacrifices she had made. Instead, she received neglect, cruelty, and abandonment. The heartbeat that had once raced with joy now often pounded with rage. Ruth's temper, quick and fierce, erupted in scenes that frightened even her friends. She would hurl words, objects, threats, anything to make him see her, to make him stay. And when he struck back, she accepted the blows as part of the terrible bargain of their love. Violence became woven into the fabric of their affair, each act leaving a mark that could not be erased, each bruise another reminder of the dangerous bond that held them together. Why, one might ask, did Ruth remain? Why did she not walk away, protect herself, protect her child? The answer lies perhaps in the depths of her longing. She had known instability since childhood, had known disappointment from men before, had known the emptiness of promises broken. In David, she saw not only a lover, but a symbol of all she desired: passion, glamour, security, belonging. To let him go would be to admit defeat, to admit that her dreams could never be realized. And so she clung to him, even as he slipped further away, even as he humiliated her, even as he drove her toward despair. Theirs was a relationship spoken of in whispers, noticed in scandal. Others saw what Ruth could not, that it would not end well, that the fire would consume her. But Ruth was deaf to such warnings. Her heartbeat, quick and insistent, drowned out reason, and she followed it even into darkness. Each time he left, she waited. Each time he returned, she forgave. Each time he hurt her, she told herself it was the price of love. And so the cycle continued, faster and fiercer, until it seemed inevitable that it would one day end in violence greater than either could control. The image that remains is of a smashed glass on the floor, fragments glinting in the dim light, the drink spilled like a wound across the table. It is an unresolved image, sharp-edged and dangerous, a symbol of their love, beautiful for a moment, then broken beyond repair. The heartbeat still pounds in the silence that follows, heavy, insistent, carrying with it the certainty that the end of this affair will be written not in whispers, but in blood. The shards of glass lie scattered across the floor, their edges catching the dim light, sharp and cold. From those fragments, we move into the fragments of Ruth Ellis's own heart, for the breaking of her affair with David Blakeley came not as a single shattering, but as a series of cracks, each one deepening the loneliness that pressed upon her. The passion that had once burned so brightly was now smoldering, leaving behind smoke and ash. What had begun as a whirlwind of speed and laughter now faltered into silence, long nights of waiting by the window, hours of unanswered questions. Ruth's world was never one of stability, but in David's absence it grew even more unsteady. He withdrew from her, choosing his fiancée's company, choosing the circles of wealth and society that had no place for Ruth and her son. He ignored her letters, avoided her calls, and when he did appear, it was often only to wound her further, his words cutting, his behavior careless. For Ruth, this neglect was a form of torture. She had given herself to him, endured humiliation, suffered physical pain, clung to him through violence, and now he drifted away as though she were nothing. In the clubs where she still worked, she tried to hold her mask of glamour. She smiled, she poured drinks, she laughed at jokes. Yet behind the performance, her spirit was fraying. Friends saw her growing thin, her eyes tired, her temper more fragile than ever. They warned her that David had moved on, that she should let him go, that no good could come of clinging to him. Ruth listened perhaps, but she could not accept. The thought of losing him entirely filled her with a despair deeper than any she had known. To be without him was to be without meaning, without hope, without the dream she had built around his presence. Loneliness became her constant companion. She returned to her small rooms after nights of hostessing, the laughter of others still ringing in her ears, only to find herself alone, the silence pressing in on her. Her son, though beloved, could not fill the void that David's absence created. Ruth wanted not only to be a mother but to be desired, cherished, chosen. Instead, she found herself discarded, left to imagine him in the arms of another woman, left to replay their quarrels in her mind, left to wonder what she might have done differently to keep him. At times, she sought distraction in other men, brief encounters, fleeting attentions, yet none satisfied her. Each only reminded her of what she had lost, of the intensity she could not recapture. She compared them all to David, and all fell short. The fire he had ignited in her could not be extinguished, and it could not be replaced. It burned still, though it now consumed her from within. The loneliness of these months sharpened her anger. She grew more possessive, more desperate. She confronted him, demanded explanations, pleaded for his return. He responded with avoidance, with cruelty, with indifference. The more he withdrew, the more she pursued, as though her persistence might force him to acknowledge her. Yet her pursuit only deepened his rejection, and each rejection deepened her despair. The image of Ruth during this time is one of a woman caught in a spiral, unable to climb free. She was glamorous still, admired still, yet within she was unraveling. The confidence that once carried her into clubs and contests was eroded by humiliation. The mask she had worn for so long was cracking, revealing the fragility beneath. She could not sleep, she could not rest, her thoughts consumed by him. Friends saw the change, saw her growing instability, but what could they do? The hunger of the heart cannot be reasoned with, and Ruth's heart beat only for David, even as he turned away. The loneliness of her nights grew heavier with the sound of rain. Often she would wait outside pubs or clubs where she thought he might be, standing in the drizzle, her coat drawn tight, her eyes scanning every passing car. Sometimes he appeared, sometimes not. When he did, he often ignored her, sometimes ridiculed her, sometimes struck her. Yet still she returned, night after night, hoping. The image is haunting. A woman standing in the rain outside a pub window, her hair damp, her face pale, waiting for a man who no longer cared. It is in these scenes that the inevitability of what was to come begins to take shape. The passion had turned to obsession, the love to desperation, the bond to a chain that bound her even as it cut her. Ruth could not let go, and David would not stay. The tension between them grew unbearable, and those who watched could only sense that it must end, though none knew yet how final the ending would be. The rain drips against the glass of a pub window, slow, steady, unresolved. Behind the glass, voices murmur, glasses clink, laughter rises. Outside, Ruth waits, her eyes fixed, her heart pounding, her loneliness heavy as the night. The rain continues, drop by drop, carrying us into the next chapter of her life, where despair would harden into violence, and the story would turn irrevocably toward tragedy. The rain dripping against the glass of a pub window falls slowly, steadily, each drop like a muted clock marking the passage of time. And from this steady rhythm we arrive at another day of waiting, though this one would be unlike the others. It was Easter Sunday in April 1955, and Ruth Ellis, worn thin by months of neglect, humiliation, and despair, stood outside the Magdala Tavern in Hampstead. The rain had lifted, but the dampness lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of tobacco and spilled ale drifting from the pub's open door. She was not there as a hostess, not as a companion seeking laughter or drink, but as a woman who had reached the end of endurance. In her handbag lay a small revolver, cold and heavy, its presence both terrifying and strangely inevitable. The Magdala stood as any London pub might. Brick walls darkened by weather, windows fogged by breath, voices rising in cheer from within. Yet on that afternoon it became the stage for the final act of Ruth's tragic story. She had arrived earlier, restless, agitated, her mind consumed by the certainty that David Blakeley, the man who had so long been the center of her obsession, was inside or near. She had followed him before, had waited in the rain, had pleaded for his attention, but now she carried not only longing, but a weapon, as though to make visible the violence that had for so long remained hidden in their love. David did appear, stepping out into the light of day, his figure confident, careless, as though untouched by the storm he had left within Ruth. He wore the ease of a man belonging to another world, and in that moment he looked past her, perhaps dismissing her as he had so many times before. But Ruth could not bear dismissal any longer. Her life had narrowed to this one unbearable point. The love she could not relinquish, the betrayal she could not endure, the humiliation that had hollowed her to the core. She raised the revolver, her hand trembling yet determined, and fired. The shots rang out sharp against the hum of voices, silencing laughter, scattering birds from the eaves. Witnesses froze in shock. David staggered, struck by the bullets, his body collapsing onto the pavement. The noise of the city seemed to vanish for a moment, replaced only by the echo of gunfire still ringing in ears, the acrid scent of gunpowder mixing with the damp air. Ruth did not flee. She did not scream. She stood still, the revolver still in her hand, her face calm, almost serene, as though the storm within her had at last broken. People rushed forward, some to help David, some to seize Ruth. The revolver was taken from her hand, and she offered no resistance. When questioned, she spoke words that would become infamous, words delivered with quiet clarity. "It is obvious when I shot him, I intended to kill him." No excuses, no denial, only the stark acknowledgement of her act. In that sentence, She seemed to carry not only her own despair, but the weight of all the violence that had defined her love, as though by speaking plainly she could strip away the pretenses of passion and reveal the truth at last. The scene outside the Magdala was chaotic. A man dying, a woman calm in custody, bystanders murmuring in disbelief. News spread quickly, for such an act in broad daylight in public view was sensational. Ruth, the glamorous hostess, the blonde beauty of clubs and contests, had become a murderess before the eyes of London. The city that had once admired her now whispered her name with shock, with judgment, with fascination. The clink of glasses that had so often accompanied her nights was replaced now by the ringing echo of shots, a sound that would haunt her memory and that of all who had seen it. For Ruth, there was no attempt to escape the truth. She admitted her guilt from the first moment, her confession as direct as the act itself. Some have wondered whether in that moment she sought release, whether the act was not only vengeance against David, but also an end to her own suffering, a surrender to the law that would inevitably claim her. Perhaps in raising the revolver, she was not only ending his life, but also sealing her own fate, weary of the endless cycle of passion and despair. The crowd outside the pub slowly dispersed, the day returning to its ordinary rhythm, though nothing would ever be ordinary again for Ruth Ellis. She was taken away, the sound of handcuffs clicking around her wrists, the murmurs of witnesses following. Behind her lay the body of the man she had loved beyond reason, a man whose charm and cruelty had bound her in chains more powerful than iron. Ahead of her lay the trial, the judgment, the gallows. The echo of the shots lingers still, unresolved, hanging in the air like the tolling of a bell that cannot be silenced. Each sound is both an ending and a beginning, the end of David's life, the beginning of Ruth's final descent. And in that lingering echo lies the question she herself never answered. Was this act born of rage, of despair, of love twisted beyond recognition? Or was it simply the inevitable conclusion of a life defined by passion too fierce to survive? The ringing shot hangs in the silence, carrying us forward to the next stage of her story, where confession and judgment would intertwine in the cold halls of the court. The ringing of the shot still trembles in the air as if the city itself has not yet taken its next breath, and from that echo comes another sound, the metallic click of handcuffs closing around Ruth Ellis's wrists. It is a sound as cold as the revolver she has just released, as final as the body lying on the pavement outside the Magdala Tavern. The crowd, shaken into silence, watches as she is led away. She does not struggle. She does not weep. Her face, pale and composed, reveals a calm that unsettles those who see her. In the space of a few minutes, she has crossed from longing lover to confessed murderess, and she seems to accept it with a serenity that no one can quite explain. The police escort her into custody, their boots heavy on the pavement, their voices curt but controlled. They expect protest, excuses, pleading, but Ruth gives none. Instead, when asked why she fired, she answers with the same clarity that marked her act. "It is obvious when I shot him I intended to kill him." The words are plain, unadorned, without hysteria. To some, they reveal defiance. To others, they reveal despair. To Ruth herself, perhaps they are simply truth spoken aloud at last, the truth of a love that had long since curdled into violence, of a heart that could no longer bear humiliation. The journey from street to station is short, yet within it her fate is sealed. She is searched, questioned, her statement taken down. The revolver is catalogued, the witnesses' accounts gathered. Already the machinery of justice begins to turn, swift and inexorable. Ruth does not resist its weight. She sits quietly, answering when spoken to, her voice steady. Those who observe her remark on her composure, her detachment, as though she has stepped outside her own life and is now watching its end unfold from a distance. News spreads quickly. The murder of David Blakeley by his glamorous lover is sensational, and newspapers seize upon it with eagerness. Headlines appear, photographs of Ruth reprinted, her past as a hostess, a model, a mother laid bare for public consumption. She becomes not only a criminal, but a spectacle, her beauty and notoriety magnifying the fascination of the crime. To the public, she is both villain and victim, both femme fatale and tragic figure. Some condemn her instantly, others pity her, but all are captivated by her story. In her cell, Ruth remains calm. She writes letters. She speaks with warders. She waits. There is no hysteria, no collapse. Perhaps she has already accepted the inevitability of her punishment, or perhaps she is simply too exhausted by years of passion and pain to fight any longer. The silence of the cell is different from the silence of her waiting nights. It carries not loneliness, but finality. For the first time in years, there is no need to wonder whether David will arrive, whether he will strike her, whether he will stay. The cycle has ended, and in its ending, Ruth finds a strange kind of stillness. When her case comes before the court, it does so with remarkable swiftness. The trial begins in July 1955, only weeks after the shooting. The courtroom is crowded, the air heavy with anticipation. Ruth stands before the judge and jury, her blonde hair carefully arranged, her dress neat. She appears calm, composed, even dignified. To those who had only known her through the sensational headlines, she seems almost gentle, her voice quiet, her manner courteous. But when asked about the shooting, she gives the same answer she had given before. She had intended to kill him. There is no plea of accident, no suggestion of diminished responsibility, no attempt to soften the act. The law, with its rigid clarity, requires little more. The jury, bound by evidence and confession, cannot ignore what she herself has declared. The trial is brief, lasting only 2 days. The defense offers little more than context: her abusive relationship, her fragile state, the humiliation she endured. But the law of murder in Britain at that time allows for no shades of gray. Intent to kill, proven and admitted, demands only one sentence: death. The judge dons the black cap, his voice solemn as he pronounces the verdict. Ruth Ellis is guilty of murder. She is to be hanged by the neck until she is dead. The words fall with the weight of inevitability, as cold and final as the handcuffs that first closed upon her. The courtroom murmurs, the public debates, but Ruth herself remains composed. She nods slightly, accepts the sentence, and is led away. In that moment, she seems less like a criminal and more like a figure already passing into legend. Her fate sealed not only by her act, but by the severity of a law that allows no mercy. Outside the court, opinions divide. Some insist justice must be carried out, that murder must not go unpunished. Others whisper that she is as much a victim as David, that her hanging would be a cruelty as great as her crime. The debate begins, and it will not end until long after the gallows have claimed her. In Holloway Prison, she waits, her days measured by the rhythm of footsteps in corridors, the clang of doors, the quiet voices of those who come to see her. She receives visitors, she writes letters, she maintains her composure. Warders remark on her dignity, on her politeness, on the calm with which she faces her fate. She does not beg for reprieve, though petitions are gathered on her behalf, letters sent to the Home Secretary pleading for mercy. Thousands sign, but the government does not bend. The law is clear, and the machinery of justice continues without pause. The image that lingers is the sound of handcuffs closing, still unresolved, still echoing. That metallic click marks the moment when Ruth Ellis's life ceased to be her own, when the path to the gallows became unavoidable. It is the sound of finality disguised as routine, the sound of justice and tragedy intertwined. And from that sound we are carried forward into the cold corridors of prison, where footsteps fade into silence, leaving only the waiting and the inevitability of dawn. The sound of the handcuffs closing lingers like a metallic echo. And from that echo, we find ourselves in the stillness of the courtroom, where the air is thick with whispers and expectation. The case of Ruth Ellis has drawn more attention than most, for it is not merely the story of a crime, but of a woman whose beauty and scandalous life have captured the imagination of a weary public. Here, in this hall of law, the weight of justice presses down, measured not by passion or pity, but by the cold lines of statute and precedent. Ruth stands in the dock, her blonde hair carefully arranged, her face pale yet composed. She wears a simple suit, chosen not for allure, but for dignity. Around her, the murmur of the crowd rises and falls like the tide, their eyes fixed upon her as though she were both actress and accused, her life turned into a performance none can look away from. The judge presides in his robes, his voice solemn, his expression unyielding. The jurors, 12 ordinary men and women, sit with papers before them, their pens scratching, their eyes shifting between Ruth and the counsel. The trial, brief as it was, unfolds with a clarity that leaves little space for hope. Witnesses recount the scene outside the Magdala Tavern, the sound of shots, the sight of David Blakeley collapsing to the pavement, the calmness with which Ruth surrendered her revolver. The police speak of her confession, her words plain and direct. Medical experts confirm the wounds that ended David's life. All the facts align, and in their alignment, the law sees no ambiguity. Murder, defined and proven. The defense attempts what it can. They speak of her despair, of the abuse she endured, of her fragile state of mind. They paint her not as a monster, but as a woman broken by passion and cruelty, driven to the edge by humiliation and neglect. They hope to stir sympathy, perhaps to sway the jury toward leniency. Yet the law at that time offers little room for shades of gray. To admit intent to kill is to admit murder, and for murder the punishment is fixed: death. Ruth herself offers no plea, no denial. She stands with composure, her voice quiet, her words clear. When asked if she understood the charge, she replied that she did. When asked about the shooting, she repeated that she had intended it. There is no attempt to soften, no attempt to excuse. It is as though she has accepted the inevitability of her fate, as though in her mind the trial is less about her guilt than about the formality of declaring it. Some in the gallery are unsettled by this calm. They expect tears, pleas, hysteria. Instead, they see a woman who faces the law with the same stillness with which she had faced her arrest. When the jury withdraws, they are gone only briefly. The evidence is overwhelming, the confession plain. They return with a verdict of guilty. The word falls heavy in the courtroom, though it surprises no one. The judge, donning the traditional black cap, speaks the sentence in solemn tones. Ruth Ellis is to be taken from this place to a place of lawful execution, and there hanged by the neck until she is dead. May God have mercy on her soul. The black cap, the words, the silence that follows, these are rituals of death, ancient and formal, carried out with the gravity of centuries. Ruth bows her head slightly, acknowledging the sentence, offering no protest. She is led away, her figure small against the weight of the law, her footsteps quiet against the stone. Outside, the crowd surges with reaction. Some mutter that justice has been served, that murder must not go unanswered. Others shake their heads, speaking of her as a tragic figure, a woman punished as much for her life as for her act. The newspapers seize upon every detail, her appearance in court, her calm confession, the black cap of the judge. By evening, her face and name are once again on every front page. Her story no longer that of a hostess or lover, but of the last woman condemned to death in Britain. In prison, she receives the news of her sentence with the same composure. She writes letters, she speaks with her lawyers, she accepts visitors. She does not rage, she does not beg. To those who speak with her, she seems resigned, as though the act of shooting David had already sealed her fate, and the trial was but a formal procession toward its conclusion. Warders remark on her politeness, her calm, her dignity. They see no hysteria in her, only a quiet acceptance that unsettles them more than any outburst could have done. Yet beyond the prison walls, debate begins to stir. In pubs, in parlors, in Parliament itself, voices rise to question whether the sentence is just. Some argue that she is as much a victim as David, that her execution would be an act of cruelty. Others insist that the law must be upheld, that to spare her would be to undermine justice. Petitions are circulated, signatures gathered, appeals made to the Home Secretary for mercy. Thousands add their names, but the government does not bend. The law is clear, and in 1955, Britain still holds fast to the rope and the gallows as instruments of justice. The image that remains from the courtroom is that of the judge setting aside the black cap, the symbol of death now carried into the silence that follows. It is an image unresolved, heavy with finality, yet filled also with unease. For in the gallery, and in the streets outside, and in homes across the nation, people cannot help but wonder whether justice has been served or whether tragedy has been compounded. And in that wondering, Ruth Ellis becomes more than a woman in a dock. She becomes a symbol, her story echoing beyond the courtroom, carrying us forward into the prison corridors, where she will wait for the footsteps of dawn. The image of the black cap fades into silence, and from that silence we step into the long corridors of Holloway Prison, their walls cold and unyielding, their air heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Here Ruth Ellis was led after her trial, her fate sealed by the solemn words of the judge, her days now measured not in hopes for love but in the narrow rhythm of prison routine. The corridor floors echoed with the tread of warders' boots, a sound both steady and indifferent, each step marking the passing of hours toward a dawn that grew closer with every night. Holloway was not unfamiliar with condemned women, yet Ruth's presence there carried a peculiar gravity. She was young still, striking in appearance, and unlike many who had come before her, she remained composed, as though she had already surrendered to the inevitability of her fate. Prison officers who guarded her spoke later of her politeness, her quiet dignity, the way she thanked them for small kindnesses. She did not rage against her sentence, nor did she break down into despair. Instead, she carried herself with the same stillness she had shown in court, as though the storm of her life had finally exhausted itself and left only calm in its wake. Her cell was small, the walls bare, the bed narrow. Each day followed a strict order, meals brought in, visitors received, letters written. Yet within this routine lay moments of humanity. Ruth wrote to her family, to friends, to those who had stood by her. She expressed sorrow for what she had done, sorrow for the pain caused, though she did not deny her act nor retract her confession. She seemed less concerned with her own fate than with the fate of her children. Her letters to her son Andy carried a tenderness that revealed the heart of a mother, a woman who longed to protect even as she knew she would soon be absent from his life. Visitors who saw her in those final weeks were struck by her composure. She dressed neatly, held her head high, spoke calmly. Some remarked that she seemed almost relieved, as though the years of passion and violence had drained her, and now she was content to let the law bring an end to it all. Others believed she hoped still for a reprieve, that the petitions being circulated might spare her. Yet Ruth herself gave little sign of expectation. She prepared for the end with the same quiet certainty with which she had confessed her crime. The petitions did indeed gather strength. Thousands signed, voices rose in Parliament and in the press, urging the government to grant mercy. Some argued that Ruth was a victim of abuse, that her act was born not of cold calculation, but of despair. Others pointed to her calmness as evidence that she was resigned, that sparing her would serve no purpose. Yet the Home Secretary, faced with the law's rigidity and the precedent of past cases, refused to intervene. In 1955 Britain, murder still demanded the gallows, and Ruth Ellis, despite the petitions, despite the sympathy she evoked, would not be spared. The prison chaplain visited her often, offering prayers, speaking of forgiveness, of salvation. Ruth listened politely, though her own thoughts remained her own. Some said she did not seek redemption in religion, that her dignity lay instead in acceptance, in facing what was to come without illusion. Others believed she found comfort in those conversations, that the chaplain's presence eased her solitude. The truth is hidden within the silence she kept, a silence deeper than words. At night, Holloway grew quiet. The footsteps in the corridors faded, the doors locked, the lights dimmed. In that silence, Ruth lay awake, listening to the stillness, perhaps thinking of her children, perhaps recalling the laughter and violence of her past, perhaps simply waiting. The sound of footsteps would return each morning, but in those midnight hours there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant toll of a bell or the faint cry of another prisoner. For Ruth, each night brought her closer to dawn, and each dawn brought her closer to the gallows. Those who saw her in those final days spoke of her beauty, undiminished even within the prison walls. Her hair was kept neat, her clothes plain but well arranged. She carried herself with poise, as though she wished to face death not as a figure of scandal, but as a woman of dignity. Some found this composure chilling, others inspiring. To Ruth, perhaps, it was simply necessity, the only way she could endure the waiting. The corridors of Holloway held many stories, but none so talked of as hers. Warders whispered of her calm, prisoners spoke of her with fascination, the outside world speculated endlessly. Yet within those walls, Ruth remained simply a woman waiting for her end. She was stripped of glamour, stripped of attention, stripped of the chaos that had once surrounded her. Only the silence remained, and within it the quiet strength with which she faced her fate. The image that lingers is of footsteps fading in the corridor, the sound receding until only silence remains. That silence is unresolved, carrying us forward into the whispers outside the prison walls, where the public debate over her fate grows louder, where voices rise in petition and protest, and where the question of mercy becomes more urgent than ever. The footsteps fade down the corridor until silence takes their place, and into that silence another sound begins to rise, not within the prison walls, but outside them, in the streets, in parlors, in pubs, in the halls of Parliament. It is the murmur of voices, the whisper of questions, the stirring of a public conscience uneasy with what has been decreed. For while Ruth Ellis waits in Holloway with composure and quiet, the world beyond those locked gates cannot keep still. Letters are written, signatures gathered, petitions carried from door to door. Each one bears the name of someone who believes that her life should not end on the gallows. Each one pleads for mercy in a society where the law allows so little room for it. The story of Ruth Ellis has captured the imagination of the nation. Newspapers print her photograph daily, the blonde hair, the poised face, the eyes that look both strong and vulnerable. Her name is spoken in households that would never otherwise discuss the fate of a nightclub hostess. To some, she is a cold-blooded murderer, guilty without question, deserving of the rope. To others, she is a tragic woman, undone by love, a victim of cruelty and neglect, driven to desperation. The debate divides families, friends, even strangers in the street. In pubs, men raise their glasses and argue. One insists that murder is murder, that the law must be upheld. Another counters that hanging a woman, especially one so young, is barbaric. In parlors, women speak of her as one of their own, someone who suffered violence at the hands of a man and was now to be punished for striking back. In Parliament, MPs receive stacks of letters urging reprieve, voices demanding that the Home Secretary intervene. The petitions grow into the thousands, a tide of signatures that reveal how deeply her case has touched the public conscience. Yet the government remains unmoved. The Home Secretary, bound by the law and by precedent, considers the matter with formality. He reviews the petitions, he examines the trial, and he concludes that there is no ground for mercy. The law has spoken. The crime was murder. The punishment is death. To bend the rule now would, in his mind, undermine the very foundation of justice, and so the petitions, though heavy with names, fall into silence, their pleas unanswered. For Ruth, the knowledge of this debate reaches her cell in fragments. Visitors tell her of the petitions, of the letters written on her behalf, of the sympathy she inspires. She listens politely, thanks them, but does not let hope take root. Those who speak with her remark that she seems resigned, that she does not expect reprieve. Perhaps she knows that the machinery of law rarely shifts, that the tide of public opinion, however strong, cannot alter her fate. Or perhaps she is simply weary of hoping, weary of waiting for mercy that never comes. And yet, even as she accepts her fate, the debate outside continues to grow. Some writers describe her as a symbol of the injustice of capital punishment, arguing that her case proves the cruelty of the system. Others write in defense of the law, warning that emotion must not override justice. The press thrives on the controversy, publishing her image beside that of David Blakeley, contrasting the dead lover with the condemned woman. Each article, each headline, fuels the fire of debate. In the quiet of Holloway, Ruth remains removed from these voices. She writes her letters, she meets her visitors, she walks the short distance of her exercise. The sound of footsteps in the corridor is steadier than the clamor outside. For her, the question is not whether she will hang, but when. For the public, the question is whether Britain itself is ready to look upon such a punishment and call it justice. As the day of execution draws nearer, the voices grow louder. Demonstrators gather outside Holloway, their shouts carried on the wind. Some cry for mercy, some call for the law to be upheld. Policemen keep watch as crowds press closer to the gates, their faces anxious, their voices urgent. The city itself seems unsettled, as though it knows that what is about to occur will not be easily forgotten. Within her cell, Ruth hears little of the shouting. The walls are thick, the corridors long, and the voices outside are muffled into nothing. She prepares herself in her own way, quietly, without complaint. She asks after her children. She writes final words. She holds her dignity close as though it were her last possession. The petitions, the debates, the demonstrations, these belong to the world beyond the prison. Within, there is only the silence of waiting. The image that remains is of a candle, guttering in still air, its flame wavering but not yet extinguished. The petitions are the breath that tries to keep it alight, the voices of mercy, the whisper that pleads against the darkness. Yet the air grows heavier, and the flame bends lower. The candle has not yet gone out, but its end feels certain. And in that fragile light, we are carried forward to the dawn of Ruth's final day, when the footsteps will come not to deliver news, but to lead her to the gallows. The candle flame wavers in still air, its fragile light bending as though straining against an unseen breath. And from this trembling glow we are carried outward into the voices of a nation. For beyond the prison walls, Ruth Ellis's fate has become more than the story of one woman. It has become a mirror held up to Britain itself, reflecting questions of justice, of mercy, of what it means for a society to take a life in the name of law. The debate rises not only in the streets, but in the chambers of Parliament and in the pages of the press, where her case is discussed with a fervor that few others have stirred. In Parliament, the arguments unfold with the gravity of ritual. Some members stand to insist that the law must remain unbending, that murder demands death, that to show leniency would open a floodgate of sentiment over reason. Others rise with equal force to question whether such justice is just at all, whether it is right to end the life of a woman who herself had been beaten, humiliated, and driven to despair. They point to the thousands of signatures on petitions, to the voices of ordinary men and women pleading for reprieve. They ask whether the execution of Ruth Ellis would serve as deterrent or merely a spectacle. The chamber listens, the debate recorded in solemn tones, yet the machinery of government continues its course, unmoved by emotion. In the press, the arguments are less measured, more vivid. Some newspapers paint Ruth as a tragic figure, the last victim of a cruel romance, a woman undone by passion and punished by a society unwilling to see her suffering. Others portray her as dangerous, her beauty a mask for violence, her composure in court proof of cold calculation. Readers devour these accounts, forming their opinions, writing letters to editors, discussing the case in homes and workplaces. Ruth's photograph appears again and again, her blonde hair, her poised expression, her eyes that seem to hold both strength and sorrow. She is no longer merely Ruth Ellis. She has become a symbol, a canvas onto which the nation projects its anxieties about crime, punishment, and morality. Beyond Parliament and press, the public continues its debate. Clergymen preach sermons on mercy, on the sanctity of life, urging that the rope be spared. Others, equally devout, argue that justice requires no compromise, that the commandment against murder applies not only to individuals, but to the state itself. Psychologists speak of her state of mind, questioning whether she was truly in full control of her actions. Advocates for reform seize upon her case as evidence that capital punishment is no longer fitting for a modern society. In drawing rooms and on factory floors, people talk of her as though they know her personally, as though her choices were theirs to weigh. Yet in Holloway Prison, the noise of this debate barely touches Ruth. The voices are distant, the arguments abstract. For her, the days are still marked by footsteps in corridors, by meals carried in, by letters written in careful hand. The flickering candle that represents hope is not one she lights herself. It is lit by others outside, and she does not expect it to last. She does not rage at the lack of reprieve, nor does she cling to its possibility. She carries on quietly, her dignity intact, her acceptance unshaken. Still, there are moments when the weight of the debate outside presses in. She hears from her lawyers of the petitions, of the speeches, of the articles written about her. She nods, listens, thanks them. But her composure remains. Perhaps she understands what others do not, that the law is too rigid to bend for her, that her fate was sealed the moment she pulled the trigger, the moment she confessed. Or perhaps she is simply weary, too tired to hope for a mercy that seems always out of reach. The candle gutters again, its flame almost extinguished, and in its fragile light, one sees the shape of a nation divided against itself. On one side stand those who call for justice without compromise, their voices stern, their eyes fixed on the letter of the law. On the other side stand those who plead for mercy, their voices softer yet persistent, their eyes fixed on the humanity of the woman condemned. Between them lies Ruth Ellis, silent in her cell, awaiting the dawn that will decide not debate, but reality. The debate in Parliament ends without change. The petitions are filed, acknowledged, set aside. The Home Secretary, unmoved, announces that the law will take its course. The press continues its fervor, the public continues its arguments, but the machinery of justice rolls on, indifferent to noise. The candle, flickering still, cannot resist the weight of air pressing down upon it. Its light bends lower, its flame small and fragile. The image that remains is of that candle's flame, trembling, guttering, its light casting long shadows against the walls. It is a light unresolved, hinting at mercy, yet destined to be extinguished. And in that trembling glow, we are carried forward to the dawn of Ruth's final day, when the questions of debate will fall silent, and only the tolling of a bell will remain. The candle flame trembles, bends low, and at last fades into darkness, and from that darkness we move into the pale light of dawn on a July morning in 1955. It is the 13th day of the month, and within the high gray walls of Holloway Prison, Ruth Ellis awakens to her final day. Outside, the city stirs with ordinary life. Milk bottles set upon doorsteps, buses grinding into motion, shopkeepers raising shutters. But within the prison, a more solemn rhythm unfolds, one that has been rehearsed in silence, one that will end in death before the clock strikes 9. The air is still, heavy with a quiet that feels deeper than sleep. In her cell, Ruth rises with composure, her movement steady, unhurried. She has slept, though lightly, and her face shows neither hysteria nor collapse. Warders remark later on her calmness, the dignity with which she faced each step. She dresses carefully, choosing a neat suit rather than any trace of glamour. Her hair is arranged simply, her face pale but resolute. She is a woman who has accepted what must come, and in her acceptance, there is a silence more profound than protest. Before the appointed hour, she writes her final letters. Her words are tender, directed most of all toward her son. She writes of love, of regret, of the hope that he might remember her with kindness. She does not dwell on the details of her act, nor on the trial, nor on the rope that awaits her. She writes instead with the voice of a mother, wishing to leave behind not scandal, but love. These letters, sealed and delivered later, become the last trace of her own hand upon the world, her voice carried beyond the walls, even as her body is claimed by the gallows. The chaplain visits her, offering prayer, speaking of forgiveness, of eternity. Ruth listens quietly, politely, though what she believes in these moments remains hidden within her. Some say she accepted the chaplain's words, that she found comfort in the thought of mercy beyond this life. Others believe she remained steadfast in her silence, her acceptance rooted not in faith, but in dignity. Whichever it was, she walked beside him without hesitation, her steps even, her gaze steady. The ritual of execution is carried out with precision, every movement rehearsed, every detail prepared. The governor of the prison, the officers, the executioner, all know their parts. At 8:45, the small procession begins. The footsteps echo in the corridor, a sound that carries finality with each strike of heel on stone. Ruth walks between warders, the chaplain at her side, her body straight, her head high. She does not falter. She does not resist. To those who witness it, her calm is unforgettable, unsettling in its serenity. The gallows stand within the prison, hidden from the outside world. The chamber is stark, the rope prepared, the mechanism silent. Ruth enters without pause. The executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, performs his duties swiftly, his movements practiced, respectful without flourish. He places the white hood, adjusts the rope, checks the measure. Ruth says nothing. No cry, no plea, no final declaration. The lever is pulled, and in an instant it is done. At 9 o'clock precisely, the bell tolls. Its sound carries beyond the prison walls, heavy, resonant, marking the end of a life and the finality of the law. Outside, a crowd has gathered, some in protest, some in grim approval. When the bell strikes, they fall into silence. The petitions, the debates, the arguments, all are silenced in that single toll. Britain has hanged Ruth Ellis, and with her execution, the nation steps into a new unease, for though the law has been satisfied, conscience has not. Within the prison, the officers move with solemn efficiency. The body is taken down, the ritual completed. Outside, the news spreads swiftly. Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Britain, is dead. Newspapers print the story within hours, her photograph once more filling the front pages. Some readers feel relief, others sorrow, others anger. Yet whatever they're feeling, none can deny that something has shifted. The execution, carried out with the cold formality of justice, has stirred a deeper questioning, a recognition that the gallows may no longer sit easily upon the conscience of a modern nation. For Ruth, there's no more waiting, no more longing, no more humiliation. The silence that follows her death is deeper than the silence of her cell, deeper than the silence of prison corridors. It is the silence of finality, of a life cut short not only by her own act of violence, but by the state's unyielding retribution. Some call it justice, others tragedy. But for Ruth, it is simply the end. The image that remains is the tolling of the bell, its sound rolling outward across the city, heard by those who pause in their daily tasks, by those who whisper her name, by those who wonder what it means for Britain to take the life of a woman in such a way. The bell's echo lingers unresolved, carrying us forward into the silence that followed, when the nation itself was forced to reckon with the meaning of what had been done. The tolling of the bell drifts outward, its echo trembling in the gray air above London, and from that echo we pass into the silence that followed. The moment the clapper fell back to rest, life in the city resumed its ordinary rhythm. Buses rattled along their routes, market stalls opened, children played in the streets, but for those who had listened, the sound marked something heavier, something that could not be folded easily into the fabric of the day. Ruth Ellis was dead, and with her execution, Britain had reached a threshold it could not wholly cross back from. Newspapers carried the news with speed, some with stern headlines announcing justice, others with sorrowful words that spoke of tragedy. Photographs of Ruth appeared once more, her composed face gazing out from print as though even in death she could not be silenced. Some papers framed her as the villain of a crime of passion, the woman who had shot her lover in cold blood. Others described her as a victim, undone by cruelty and humiliation, condemned by a system that showed no mercy. The public, divided long before, grew only more divided after. In homes across the country, the conversations echoed this division. Some shook their heads and said it was right, that murder demands punishment, that the law must remain unbending if society is to hold firm. Others whispered of shame, of discomfort at the thought of a young woman, mother to children, dropped through the trap of a gallows in the name of justice. Some were relieved that it was done, others horrified, and many could not decide what they felt at all. In pubs, men spoke more bluntly. Pints were raised with the words, "Justice served." Others muttered that it was barbarism, that Britain should be above such cruelty. Arguments broke out as they had in the weeks before, only now with a finality that silenced some voices and sharpened others. The execution had not resolved the question, it had deepened it. Among women, especially those who had endured cruelty or neglect at the hands of men, the case stirred painful recognition. They saw in Ruth's story not merely scandal, but familiarity. The humiliations endured, the bruises hidden, the desperation that comes when love becomes a chain. To them, her hanging felt like punishment, not only for her crime, but for her suffering. For others, it stood as a warning that society would not forgive women who transgressed, that passion, however justified in pain, would not shield them from the rope. In Parliament and among reformers, the debate grew sharper. Some members declared that the law had done its duty, that the matter was closed. Others rose to argue that the law itself must change, that capital punishment had shown its cruelty too clearly, that the hanging of Ruth Ellis would one day be remembered not as justice, but as shame. They pointed to the public unease, to the thousands who had signed petitions, to the sorrow that many felt. They asked whether the gallows were fitting for a nation that wished to call itself civilized. For those closest to Ruth, grief was mixed with bitterness. Her children, too young to grasp the full weight of events, would grow into lives forever shadowed by the knowledge of how their mother had died. Friends who had pleaded for mercy felt betrayed by the government's unyielding stance. Some kept silent, others spoke openly, but all carried the sense that something irreversible had been done. The silence that followed the bell was not empty. It was filled with questions, with doubts, with unease. Did her crime deserve her death? Was society safer for it? Or had the gallows claimed not only a woman, but also a measure of compassion from the nation's heart? The answers were not clear, and perhaps they never could be. But the questions lingered, and in their lingering, the seeds of change were sown. The image that lingers from this silence is that of a folded newspaper left on a train seat, its headline proclaiming her death, its photograph of Ruth gazing upward from the page. A stranger might pick it up, glance, shake their head, and set it aside again. But the image remains, unresolved, carrying us forward into the years that followed, when her shadow continued to fall across debates on justice, and when her name was invoked each time the rope itself was questioned. The newspaper lies folded on a train seat, its headline stark, its photograph of Ruth Ellis gazing upward from the page with a composure now eternal. A stranger glances at it, shakes his head, leaves it behind. The train moves on, the paper is left abandoned, yet her story travels further than the steel tracks beneath. From this discarded image, we move into the years that followed her death, years in which Ruth Ellis became not simply a name in a criminal record, but a symbol carried into every debate on justice and mercy. In the months after her execution, the controversy did not fade. If anything, it deepened. Letters continued to appear in newspapers, some condemning the government's decision, others supporting it. Campaigners for abolition of capital punishment seized upon her case, pointing to the petitions ignored, the abuse she had endured, the rigidity of a law that offered no room for compassion. For them, Ruth was proof that the gallows were not instruments of justice, but relics of cruelty, blind to circumstance, blind to humanity. The government, however, remained silent. Officials insisted that the law had been applied correctly, that no miscarriage of justice had occurred. They repeated the facts. Ruth had shot David Blakeley in public. She had confessed to intending his death. The jury had returned a guilty verdict. The sentence was mandatory. In their eyes, the matter was closed. But in the public imagination, it was far from settled. The image of Ruth, young and composed, a mother as well as a lover, weighed upon the conscience of many who had once accepted the gallows as necessary. As years passed, her story was invoked again and again. Each time a new execution was scheduled, her name was remembered, her face reprinted, her case cited as an example of the cruelty of capital punishment. Campaigners spoke of her not only as an individual, but as a turning point, the moment when the nation began to see the rope not as justice, but as shame. Parliament debated the matter, the voices for abolition gaining strength with each session. By the 1960s, the tide had shifted enough that capital punishment was suspended and later abolished for murder in Britain. When that moment came, many recalled Ruth Ellis as the last woman to hang, the figure whose death had planted doubt even in those who once believed the gallows were necessary. Her memory lingered in other ways too. Books were written, plays performed, films produced. Some sought to tell her story with sympathy, others with sensationalism, but all recognized its power. Audiences were drawn not merely to the crime, but to the tragedy of a woman caught in love's destructive grasp, undone by her choices and by a society unwilling to see her suffering. For decades after her death, her name remained a touchstone in discussions of justice, gender, and the cost of passion. For her family, the shadow was longer still. Her children grew into lives forever marked by her absence, forever burdened by the knowledge of how she had died. Friends and relatives carried the weight of grief and of bitterness, remembering her as both victim and perpetrator, unable to separate the woman they had known from the crime that defined her end. In their memories, she was not merely the last woman hanged, but Ruth, a daughter, a mother, a friend, flawed and fragile, radiant and restless. The unmarked grave where she was first laid to rest stood as a quiet testament to her anonymity in death, yet over time even that silence gave way to remembrance. Visitors left flowers, journalists wrote of her burial, campaigners invoked her name. The grave became a place not of spectacle, but of reflection, where those who stood there could ponder the cruelty of her end and the questions it left behind. The discarded newspaper on the train seat fades now into the image of a gray sky above a graveyard, the wind moving gently through grass, the name Ruth Ellis whispered not as scandal but as history. It is an image unresolved, carrying us forward into the final chapter of her story, when memory itself becomes the ground upon which mercy and judgment continue to meet. The gray sky hangs low over the graveyard, the grass bending beneath the quiet breath of the wind, and from that muted landscape we move into the final part of Ruth Ellis's story. Not the trial, nor the gallows, nor the silence that followed, but the long shadow of memory that has stretched across decades since her death. For Ruth did not vanish when the trapdoor opened beneath her feet. She remained in the nation's mind, a figure remembered, debated, reimagined. To some, she is victim. To others, temptress. To others, martyr. To others, merely a name in a book of crimes. Yet in all these forms she endures, her story never quite settling, never quite resolved. In the years after her execution, as Britain wrestled with its conscience and slowly moved toward the abolition of capital punishment, Ruth's name was spoken whenever the subject arose. She was invoked by reformers who saw in her hanging the cruelty of the rope, who argued that her case revealed the flaws of a system that made no room for mercy. In the debates of Parliament, her face hovered like a ghost, her name whispered as evidence that the gallows belonged to another age. When at last the law changed, when execution ceased and the noose was put away, Ruth Ellis remained as a symbol of the turning point, the woman whose death had unsettled too many to allow the old ways to continue. But her memory did not rest easily. Plays and films retold her story, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with sensational flourish. Some portrayed her as a tragic heroine undone by love, others as a dangerous femme fatale, others still as an emblem of society's failure to protect women from violence. Each telling reflected more of the storyteller than of Ruth herself, for her silence at the end left space for endless interpretations. She had spoken so plainly, "It is obvious when I shot him I intended to kill him," that no one could deny her guilt. Yet beyond those words lay all the ambiguities of her life, the abuse endured, the longing for love, the desperation that consumed her. Into that silence others projected their own meanings, their own fears, their own hopes. Writers and historians returned to her again and again, sifting through her letters, her photographs, her trial records. Some argued that she should have been convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter, her mind clouded by despair, her act born of provocation. Others insisted the law had been correct, that passion cannot excuse violence, that to spare her would have been to deny justice to David Blakeley. Still others saw her as a symbol of how women's lives were judged more harshly, their reputations weighed alongside their actions, their choices scrutinized with a severity men rarely faced. In each argument Ruth was present, her story never allowed to fade. For her family, the memory was more intimate, more painful. Her children grew beneath the shadow of her absence. Her friends aged with the bitterness of what had been lost. They remembered not only the scandal, but the small things, her laugh, her temper, her tenderness with her son. These memories, fragile and private, were often drowned out by the louder voices of newspapers and playwrights. Yet they reveal another Ruth, one who cannot be captured by headlines or court records, a woman flawed, wounded, striving, and deeply human. In the wider world, Ruth Ellis has become a symbol that shifts with time. In one era, she was the scandalous hostess who shot her lover. In another, she was the tragic mother condemned by a merciless law. In another still, she is remembered as the last woman hanged in Britain, her name forever linked to the end of an ancient practice. Each generation reinterprets her, finding in her story what it needs: a warning, a cause, a mirror. The wind carries her name softly through the grass, unresolved, a question that lingers not only in history but in the hearts of those who hear it.